Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the IGNITEU New York podcast, powered by NYSTEC. I'm your host, Shay Brown, and today we have with us Dr. Lisette Nieves. Dr. Nieves, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Shay.
Now, could you start us off a little bit by telling us a little bit about yourself, giving us a little background?
Sure, happy to. So I am a lifelong New Yorker. I want to say that, born and raised. I always say via Puerto Rico. It's an important part of who I am. And I'm currently the president of the Fund for the City of New York. I've always been passionate and cared deeply around economic opportunity. And I was fortunate enough to have been one of the founders of Year Up New York City, which ultimately worked with young people between the ages of 18 and 24, not in school and not working. And so launched that initiative over 20 years ago and built partners on Wall Street with at least 27 different firms. And so then I also worked in the Bloomberg administration doing workforce development as part of the Department for Youth and Community Development. And I'm a scholar at NYU, and I write about it, and I get to talk about it, as well as run an incredible organization called the Fund for the City of New York.
Obviously, what you were doing prior for those 20 years has led you to this position now currently.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of look at it this way. I say I'm one of those people that is a scholar, practitioner, researcher. I get to look at things from all different angles. I got to understand it from a practitioner lens, from a funder lens, from a researcher lens, which is rare in the field. And I love that because I think that gives me a sense of connection to what I think are the solutions in ways that maybe others may not see.
Yeah. And for our audience, could you maybe talk about what it means to be a practitioner?
Absolutely. So when I say a practitioner, I talk about actually directly leading an initiative or impacting the policy on an initiative. I think those things, but primarily leading an initiative. So right now at the Fund for the City of New York, we have something called the Center for Youth and the Future of Work. We launched that in partnership with Dr. Noelle Anderson, who's at NYU. And we're excited to do that because we see it as an action tank in a way. So what does that mean? That means we're going to incubate both action, where there's practice happening. We're going to incubate research, where we've done. And we're also going to implement and recommend policy. And so we feel that that's a diverse way of understanding workforce, all with the voice and focus on young people.
Yeah, it's diverse, but it's also very holistic. It's a multi-pronged approach, it sounds like.
It certainly is. And rarely is that for focused on young people, right? So when we think about workforce, we think about it exactly with education.
Yeah.
So we see a both and, not an either or.
Right.
And so how do those two connect together? And so with the first book that I was able to write with Dr. Anderson, we looked at working to learn, and we're so excited about it because we think about what does it mean for young people, particularly not just here in the United States, but globally. How are they understanding markets? How are they understanding opportunity? What can we learn and what can we offer?
Yeah. Wait, for a second here, just go back. What's the title of your book and what is the basis of that? So, Dr. Nieves, you've brought these over for us. You want to give us a little background on each of these books?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the first book that we did right before the pandemic was called Working to Learn. And this book was focused on understanding how do young people understand themselves and their worker identity, this idea of what does work mean for them? How does it impact them? And we looked at the situation globally. We did not just look in New York. We looked at the apprenticeship model in Switzerland, in Germany, in Sweden, and we were really excited because at that time, everyone was talking about let's do apprenticeships. And everyone was going overseas to Europe. And what we noticed was that there were some limitations of that, right? Meaning that if you don't have an equity lens, what you're doing is just reproducing inequity. Right? So what does it mean to place someone, particularly on a track of an apprenticeship that you haven't necessarily thought about the pipeline for?
Right.
So we're really excited about. So for example, we looked at populations, particularly Syrians. We looked at people from Turkey and Germany who were not necessarily in what we would call the high impact apprenticeships. We also noted that the apprenticeships were moving much more towards graduate and doing hybrid programs with undergraduate, not standalone apprenticeships, the way that we often think about apprenticeships here. And so what that says is that work-based learning is essential And both Dr. Anderson and I talk about that, how important that is. But when we're talking about an apprenticeship model, we usually think of it outside the ed system. But when we really look at Europe, it's actually merging much closer to the ed system. And so that's what gets lost in translation. And we wanted to make that a bit clearer.
Yeah.
We also wanted to point out what was happening, particularly with populations regarding immigration. And so when we looked at particularly Turkish youth in Germany, we realized that they really were not integrated at the levels that they could be in higher paying apprenticeships. And what that means is that Turkish youth and other young people are very excited, much more about entrepreneurship. That's a global phenomenon. They're very interested in that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there aren't tracks necessarily for that. There isn't an apprenticeship structure that supports that. So then that becomes, where's the gap in this kind of apprenticeship movement we're having that is ignoring the voice of young people? And then the last thing I'd say is that in high school, really reimagining high school and reimagining even middle school to be more work-based oriented. So we talk about a need for both high scholarship and high work, that it's not a trade-off. Young people want both. Young people want both. And then we look at the second book, and we're talking about the working for a future. We went back to the United Kingdom and wanted to see Brexit. What happened post-Brexit? What did we see with young people? Everyone's talking about the impact on the population, but what did that mean? What we noticed, particularly with young people, is that we saw occupational segregation that had disproportionate racial impacts. And we were thinking enormously about that. And we said, how do we reimagine that? Like, again, just building and taking a model without thinking about the equity implications isn't enough. What are the values and ethics that are embedded in a model that we could use? There are other things that we noticed, particularly in Brexit, that we thought were fascinating, is that young people also understood, particularly in the UK, that they were feeling more constrained about their labor opportunities because before the EU was open to them. So now it's not open to them as far as employment. So think about that. We actually shortened or constricted the labor market for young people and the mobility of them. And we don't often talk about that.
Right.
You have a generation of young people that assumed a level of mobility that now don't have the economic mobility in the way that they had before.
Right.
And so the question is, how is the UK reimagining internally this economy for a generation that is quite global in nature to see opportunity much more local? So that's what we think is one of the pressing challenges here. But we're excited to see that. And then one of the other things we looked at too are populations, particularly with young people, that often are ignored when we talk about the future of work with young people. We looked at those that were justice involved. And so, this is an interesting question because sometimes young people that are court or justice involved, we provide a program or a solution where we isolate them. And we say, give them more isolation and focus, and then have them become mainstream. Well, no, there's this incredible program called Exalt that does the exact opposite. It actually says we're an alternative. And what we do is we keep them in school, young people in high school. We provide them with paid internships, right? And we provide them with additional education. And it radically changes the outcomes of these young people.
Wow.
And so that's an example of when we're talking about the future of work, what are these populations? And I'll end on the last two that I think are unique. We also looked at Native Hawaiian youth or indigenous youth. So when you look at Hawaii, you realize that less than 8% of the population is indigenous, and yet more than half of the incarcerated population is indigenous. So think about that, right? Like, put it in perspective. When you understand that, and you also understand that there's a huge movement in Hawaii, and this really relates to young people in the last decade or so, to make sure that the Hawaiian language is now integrated in higher ed and education, because it was outlawed before, right? So to understand that historically, we are seeing some incredible outcomes with young people who are getting doses of what I call highly culturally relevant education, language support with workforce development, work-based learning, and higher ed credits, who are for the first time thinking through opportunities they would have not thought through before. That's an example where we also say, too, where else around the world have we seen Indigenous populations left out? And what does it look like to reintegrate them into a mainstream economy? So I encourage everyone to read that chapter. And then the last is AI, because you can't write anything about young people without AI. We can't have a conversation about the future of work without AI.
Yeah.
And so this one particularly says what we are not doing, what we can do. One is we know that we can look at data modeling in the way that private companies have. They have forecasted jobs, most private companies, particularly financial sector, the tech sector, jobs that are going to be irrelevant in 5 years, right?
Yeah.
We know this.
Yeah.
Why aren't we using this kind of data modeling in a way that we are actually creating job taxonomies that support the kind of education and training young people could be receiving in high school and in higher ed?
Right.
And we're not doing that in the way that we can. And so that is an example of how we can be using current labor data to do that. And the thing is, it's not always in the hands of the educators. It's not always in the hands of what I call the intermediaries or practitioners that are training young people, because they're often the last to be thinking or the last to be thought of in career opportunities. And so that's why we're excited about the second book, because we believe it pushes the narrative on who are the young people, how do we think about models for integration, particularly different young people, and then also how do we think about the role of technology and forecasting what are jobs and opportunities.
Yeah. And I want to circle back a little bit to, some of the work that you did in the UK and the other areas.
Yeah.
What kind of correlation besides Hawaii have you seen with American culture in terms of the workforce that relates directly to that work?
Oh, absolutely. So there are a couple of things that we see. One is that young people are inherently more global than we had. You're not rolling back the tech revolution. Young people understand what's happening in other countries in ways we hadn't anticipated in the past. We were much more isolated. My generation was much more isolated. This generation is not. We could debate whether it's accurate or inaccurate data. That's another issue. But the question is what's happening outside of maybe their immediate community they're much more connected to.
Yeah.
I would say the other thing that I think that we see that is related is that young people want doses of work-based learning and education. The College for All movement, particularly in the United States in the last 20 years, has been something that everyone has digested, except how it is administered. And so there's a real question young people in a lot of places are what's the return on investment in my higher ed degree? Doesn't mean that they reject higher ed, but there is a move to understand micro-credentials, flexibility, a level of nimbleness around training that young people understand they need to have. So for example, I still can't believe we could have someone graduate from an undergrad degree today, a bachelor's, even an associate's, without being required to take a course in data ethics, AI. I'm shocked.
Yeah.
I'm shocked.
Yeah.
That is relevant for everyone, any career track. It's really important. And so we see that as something where there's an enormous appetite because young people are using it anyway. Right? The question is, how can it be applied in an intentional way? So it's almost like the employers are a little bit behind where the young people are in some ways. I hope that answered the question.
That answered it very, very well. And it brings me back to another question that I had. You've said work-based learning multiple times now. You want to explain for our audience what that means?
Sure. So particularly in the K through 12 settings or in higher ed, what is applied learning that's really important? So you mentioned to me even before this interview that you have a fellowship program, right?
Yeah.
Super excited. I think every place should have one, right? Because what it is this idea where learning is central to the experience in a very, very, very intentional way. It puts it on blast. What we're saying is take that fellowship, but also link it to either high school credits or college credits. That would be central to a work-based learning kind of idea. So what we learned in our first book in Working to Learn, when we interviewed even middle school students, they craved the opportunity to have more applied learning opportunities. What we've seen is there has been a shift away from that over the last 20 years. And now there's a rush to try to do it more, but we've had a generation of teachers who have not been trained in it. And so what does that look like? So if you gave me a magic wand, I literally would say, I do not understand why New York State doesn't turn the entire month of June open to high school seniors. They should be interning at every place. It should be applied. It should be, we should just be, what's happening in that month
Yeah.
of June?
No.
And imagine what that can do.
Yeah.
What that can do for career exploration, and most important, intergenerational trust building, and also letting young people see themselves as assets and controllers of their own agency
Yeah.
in ways that typically, without work-based learning, we're only privileging learners that learn in traditional ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a challenge.
Yes.
Because young people's confidence and choices are built on where they are visibly seen, understood, and heard. Work-based learning says this is another learning style and modality that allows another level of leadership, competencies, and I would say excitement to emerge in ways that we don't have right now.
No, and I love that. And I think it's really important too, because you think about it, and yes, we do really honor the people who can traditionally succeed in education. And that leaves us behind because we're leaving other people behind who can easily be incredibly successful, capable at what they're doing, all just because they learn differently. They absorb what is around them differently. They get into the workforce differently. So if we do start to address that better, that would obviously really bolster our workforce.
And it would bolster it for both, right? I would say first of all, all learners benefit from work-based learning.
Yes.
Right? So this dose of both, I think, is important. Where is it applied, right? I always say too, who was my first math teacher? Well, my first math teacher was my mother, and it was very clear when we did grocery shopping, what was on sale or not, what did discounts mean. We learned fractions very early. It was never taught to us in school that way.
Right.
But that's an example of where you can do some applied and what I say context-driven work in schools that could be really important. And so, but we're also at this tension space, particularly in high school, which is around high stakes testing. And I'm not against assessment. I'd be the last person would say that, but assessment driven only approach really limits the kind of creativity that could be there in what I call a work-based learning central kind of program, which helps those who traditionally do really well in academics and those who don't. So we have a situation right now where my generation, when you think about work, we literally, if you were 18 in the 80s or 70s, 18 in the 80s, you smell like French fries at some point in your life. You just did. It was a rites of passage. It was where you worked, and it was where you kind of developed a whole other community, a sense of work ethic. Right now, we don't see that level of energy or entrance in the same way.
Yeah.
We see young people, for many of them, their first dollar they make may be on the internet through a barter system. Think about that.
Yeah.
Right? So it's an interesting thing, but it's not regulated or organized. And so when we do an internship program, even here at the fund, high school students feel locked out of an entry market. So even when we look at those jobs that I would have said were entry-level jobs, those are now run by people who have families.
Yeah.
They're much older. I haven't seen a 15-year-old at a fry later in a long time, right? It's so where are those jobs?
Yeah.
And so it's actually the high school piece that has almost been locked out. Like literally, we will meet an 18-year-old who's graduating who had never had a job where they earned a wage. And that is just kind of to me where it's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Right? What are we saying? We're privileging one way of learning and experiencing, and yet it's narrow.
Yeah.
There needs to be a both and.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people think, not that we're just focusing on like a restaurant kind of job, but a lot of people think that, oh, well, that's not going to help me in a future career. But that's also where I got my foot in too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say this too. I think there's an important piece about what are the values and benefits of work.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a different environment where you are not infantilized.
Yeah. Yes.
You are treated as another person that has the same expectations of an outcome, which is different, right? Sometimes high school students are treated as older children versus young people or young adults. Do we get that?
Yeah.
And that's a very different orientation than it would be in a work environment. very clear outcomes and expectations. I'd also say, too, there's a whole subset of young people that are working class, that are working, that feel stigmatized that they work,
Yeah.
versus it being embraced as part of who they are.
Yeah.
There are young people who work and they see themselves as contributing towards, we call it the family wage.
Yeah.
And yet we have this romantic notion of adolescence that could be something very negative,
Right.
right? Where we should have pity, and actually it's the agency and that negotiation of power in their family that actually can reinforce why education is important, rather than say, oh, it's because they're working, school's not important.
Yeah.
So do you see how there's this tension and these assumptions around these narratives of what does adolescent mean? What does work mean? How does it impact or privilege or de-inspire education? And I think that's a tension we see in some of these education policies.
Yeah.
So we'll say, great, we're going to do an apprenticeship program with high school students or an internship program, but we won't provide them with a stipend or pay a wage. And I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Or we're going to say we're going to do that, but we're only going to do it in a school setting. Well, how was that really? So again, it's like it's a cross-sectoral solution here.
Yeah.
If we want young people to see themselves as part of the economy, then we have to find a way for it to be complemented with education versus being in conflict with.
Yeah. No, I really love that, especially you hitting on the fact that people want to create these programs, but maybe not stipend the kids for them. And I feel like that's not a really good way actually to get the kid off the ground running, because now you're teaching them that labor doesn't have value.
Correct.
Right? And how is that appropriate to educate a young person to jump into our market?
Oh, yeah. And look, I would say this, the field of entertainment, arts, and everything else has benefited enormously from free labor as well as nonprofits. And I think there's a real move in New York State to understand how important it is to have paid internships.
Yes.
Right? Because the unpaid privileges have privileged those who can afford to have subsidized those experiences.
Yes.
And as a result, have created an inequitable system of multiple tracks. Right?
You're so right.
We're well aware of that. What we love is that this paid internships make a difference. And if you care deeply about equity and talent, you should do that.
Yes.
So we pay our high school students, and I will tell you, as well as our graduate and undergrad students. But what we often hear for high school students, if they're not in the Summer Youth Employment Program in New York, which I'm really proud of, that pays high school students, there are very few, if any, opportunities for 15 and 16-year-old. And I always say this, they are too old for summer camp, but they're looked at as too young to work. But 20 years ago, that wasn't the case.
Right.
And the number one thing young people will call New York City government for is what? Summer youth employment. When does it happen? So when I was a chief of staff at the Department for Youth, I was blown away by the thousands of calls that would come in from young people wanting to know when the summer youth employment application would be available. Think about that. Young people calling the city and advocating for themselves. What does that tell us? What else do we need to hear about youth voice?
Yeah.
And yet, we still ignore it. And I think it has so much to do with these romantic notions of what we believe adolescence is.
Right. And how we value their labor. We think that, well, I have to teach you this, this, and this, and so you shouldn't get any money for that. And it's like, well, they're learning this, this, and this. That is something you should absolutely pay someone to do, because they're taking the time to learn the skills that you want them to have to be a part of your workforce.
Absolutely. And we're also in a very complicated place with this nationally, right? So I agree. Obviously, if you get to look through the books, you'll see that that's an important part, because it's also another part of the young person making choices around what do they do with their money? How do they apply it? How do they leverage it? They understand that it has a role, relevance, and power.
Yeah.
What I would say is fascinating that's happening across the country, we're seeing in different states, is that we can have this conversation while also acknowledging that there may be youth work exploitation happening in other places.
Yeah.
Right? We can. I think sometimes we avoid these conversations, or what I think are important, because we say, well, we know X state's looking at lowering the age where young people could work in chicken processing plants because they can't hire enough people, right?
Yeah.
Or saying that children are allowed to work overnight shifts versus, oh no, there's a lot happening around this country. And that is to fill labor shortages. So there is a piece of it that can be exploitive, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about at the same time too, how what we do know from the European model is they recognize from a very highly federalized system, centralized system, that young people need to be integrated into their economy early and intentionally. We are very much more sporadic about that.
Yeah.
We count on the states to do that. But I'm proud New York State is making sure that we look more at paid internships. I am seeing higher ed leaders for the first time talking in very strategic ways about workforce outcomes. High school, even our chancellor in the New York public school system is looking at this. But again, stipended, looking at it with high doses of academics too, it's still almost trade-off-y in many of the programs versus highly integrated in a way that I think would benefit more young people.
Yeah. And I think this leads into, the next kind of part of our conversation where we talk about, you've hit on it a little bit, credentialing and maybe going that route. Because a lot of the times what we're seeing right now is young people don't necessarily want to go and get a 4-year or even 2-year degree because of the cost.
Oh, absolutely. The affordability has, first of all, the level, we often don't talk about this question of underemployment. So people who have degrees but are in jobs that may not require a degree. Right? And so young people see that. They see the debt loads that others have carried. We know there have been incredible studies coming out of Ed Trust and others that show the disproportionate impacts, particularly African American women, and the level of debt that they have. We see the underemployment, particularly of Latina women who might disproportionately be in jobs where a degree is not required, and yet they have a degree. So we see these kind of impacts, and young people see them.
Yeah.
They're well aware. It's in their neighborhoods. Guess what? They're digesting this.
For sure.
And so this return on investment's a real question. And so they are looking at micro-credentials, but I would say the whole market of employment is looking at micro-credentials. Right?
Yes.
All of us need to retool and rethink, right?
And that should make people question, okay, so should there be a reformation of how we're educating our youth? If we recognize the fact that we have to continue to educate ourselves as we continue to move throughout our career.
Absolutely. Lifelong learning is really important. And there are quite a few people who are talking about that. What does that mean to have this idea of a wallet of learning that we can add all these credentials? I'd also say, too, that how do we make sure that we don't see that people are exploited in this market as well, too?
Right.
What does it mean to have a high quality credential? And I think, so right now we have huge levels of innovation, but the quality control is something we need to think about too. Right now, I'm super excited. We have a team member of ours that you get to meet earlier today, and he's done really well. And he's like, I'm going to get this AI credential. And it's like, this is how I'm going to apply it, right?
Yeah.
We think really intentionally about what are those extra credentials that we need to have.
Right.
It's anybody who is leading right now, if they are not skilled or in the competencies or the frameworks of how do you manage in a rapidly changing environment, then they are not learning. Right. And so that's actually important too. So at any age across the spectrum, as far as workers, we need to be thinking about micro-credentials. And I would say that's something, I would say our union history has done well, and they've always thought about what are extra pieces that we can add for workers that can help them move forward. Our public sector has done that. But the coordination now for a broad audience, we need to be more intentional in ways and highlight the models that are high quality, because we have people who are paying a lot for credentials, but it may not be linked to employment. And that's what I really want to see. I want to see, okay, if you are getting this credential, what is it converting to? Because what then we're transferring is saying this credential instead of a college degree, but if you're not getting an outcome, then did we improve that person's life?
Right.
Yeah. Or their economic mobility? So we have to remember that there has to be a way of looking at this, as you said earlier, holistically.
Right. Yeah. And I think, recognizing the fact that exploitation can kind of happen anywhere in education.
Anywhere.
It's trying to navigate, okay, how do we communicate to not only just the youth now, but older audiences of how to continue to grow in like you said, have economic mobility, grow in their career, have different experiences. It's really important that we kind of address the fact that micro-credentialing is really important right now, and it's a big deal, but some things might be a lot of money for no payoff. So how do we communicate that?
So a couple of years ago, I wrote an article about how to pick your tech apprenticeship and to really sort that out. There are great questions to ask up front. It's always important to understand, why was the fellowship or apprenticeship created to begin with? Is it linked to a credentialing? Where are the alums? How do you know there's a commitment to alums? Those kinds of things. It's important to ask those questions up front. I would say young people are asking those questions. I would say older workers may not be used to asking those questions in the same way.
Yeah.
And so I do think we need to make that much more transparent.
Yeah.
I'd love to see more scorecards of what we say are these kind of micro credentials in a way that it's easier for people to understand.
Yeah.
What I would also say is that post the COVID pandemic, people get the hybrid learning experience. It's a both and too.
Yeah.
We are not going back to everyone just sitting at a desk. What I do know too is that we also have to still monitor what are the remote credentials that are happening. So how can we keep improving that particular piece?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is an important piece to talk about, the remote learning aspect of things and making things more accessible to people. I think that was really wonderful that came out of the pandemic. That was one good thing, right? Is making education more accessible to people all over the globe. I know that I myself have taken like a workforce development class myself with people from all over the US.
Yes.
And that is also great because you're getting to experience different cultures at the same time while you're learning. Like you're learning what it's like in the workforce in another area, like California, for instance, and pulling that in.
Oh, yeah. For adult learners, having applied learning and building relationships that are related to what they want to build their competency on has an enormous return on investment. And we see that. I was excited to be able to co-found a doctorate in leadership and innovation at NYU.
Oh.
And we were looking particularly at saying, what are the needs, particularly of executives who are interested in getting a credential, particularly maybe a doctorate at the time, but wanted to pursue something that was related and work-based and oriented, where it was around a problem of practice. So a traditional doctorate would not allow that experience to happen. But if we did a degree in leadership and innovation, made it cross-sectoral in nature, knowing that we have the largest global footprint, which is NYU, what would that look like? We are now 9 classes in, close to 200 graduates from around the globe who have done these problems of practice and received their doctorates in everything from doing early childhood outcomes in Singapore, looking at workforce outcomes in New York State. Folks who want to look at a particular challenge at the executive level, but they need to pull out, look at what are different frameworks to help them be intentional about their solution that they're proposing. And so we often expect people to be innovative, but we don't have the preconditions for the innovation. What does it mean to have preconditions? Preconditions include, most innovators do not just look for solutions in their silo. They go outside their silo.
Yes.
So if they don't know people outside their silo, we're removing one precondition. The other is time to reflect and be in a community of people who feel a sense of urgency and need to change, other than those that report to them. So there's a peer group which lets a level of vulnerability and collaboration happen in a way that wouldn't otherwise. And then I also say, how do we add a high dose of what I call intellectual, while allowing there to be in the center of all this, their experience is valued. And so that's an example of a creation of a program where the preconditions for innovation are met, And thus we get to, that's why I get to do such exciting global work, because I get to see people doing amazing things where someone will say, I'm in Dubai building a school system, and oh my goodness, I would have never known that my HR and pipeline challenges might match someone who's dealing with that in a healthcare setting in Michigan, right? And then how I always say, meet at the ideas, not the silos. Meet at the challenges, not the silos. But if we don't have the preconditions set for leaders to do that, we are not going to get the outcomes we'd like to see.
What an incredible program at NYU that you helped put together. That's really unique.
Yeah.
Are there any other programs that you know of in the nation that are like that?
Not that are called leadership and innovation, more are trying to do it, which I'm excited about.
Yeah.
I mean, what do they say? Flattery.
Mimicry is the highest form of flattery.
Exactly. Dr. Anderson and I had this vision for this program, and but it is still unique. It is primarily remote. But what we also are pushing, which I think is key, is that you can do high tech and high touch with adult learners. Right?
Okay.
High tech and high touch.
What do you mean by that?
So we have a high synchronous connection online. So we are intentional about building community. And you could do that remote in a way that you said. We can't assume it happens on its own. There has to be a level of intentionality around that. Understanding adult learners learn both vertically and horizontally.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
But if you're not intentional of the preconditions for that, or intentional about the teaching of that, it will lay flat. So that's what we do.
Okay. That is very unique. I certainly have not heard of a program like
Come
that
see
before. Yeah.
Come see it.
It seems really, really cool. I would love to learn more about it. I'm sure our audience would as well. So I'm glad we brought that up. So continuing to talk about college a little bit, we're not against a 4-year degree. We're not telling people to not go get 2 or 4-year degrees, but there are other ways of getting degrees maybe that might not be as economically burdensome.
Oh, there's absolutely no question. Look, I always say the creatives of the world are, first of all, we couldn't survive without creatives. But the creatives of the world are often stifled because these traditional tracks have not worked for them anyway. Right? I mean, I see that, right? I have a tech creative, my son, who's like, I don't believe in the return on investment of degree. That's a little stressful for me. I understand that. I feel like that old commercial of the hair club for men. I'm a member as well, right? They surprise you at the end. But what I love about it is that through his lens of a 20-year-old, he's saying, I love technology, but why am I going to go into a degree like that? Right. And so he's looking at alternative degrees. There are great programs throughout the state. Perscolis is amazing. Genesis Works is amazing. Marcy Labs are amazing. All of these programs really think about how can we keep the young person who is highly motivated and interested in this area to get this credential, place them in work. And what we learn, and we knew this with Year Up, which was fascinating, is that once you place them, guess what? They become the consumers of lifelong learning and most likely will go back to college.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
So it's not, I always say this is the beauty of New York, and particularly New York City. People are reinventing themselves all the time. That's beautiful.
It is.
I love that part, which means that when they're reinventing themselves, and young people today expect at least 8, could you imagine, job changes? And that could be career changes over their lifetime. Wow. That means learning is a default.
Right.
So they are going to get it both traditional and non-traditional routes. We're going to just look at it as credentialing versus a bachelor's versus going to Perscolis for 6 months, right? We're going to look at these things in ways we hadn't before. So I'm excited to see that kind of merging. What I will say, higher ed can push themselves in becoming much more trusting of intermediaries.
Yes.
There is this kind of third sector of folks who are able to negotiate with the employers and train in a nimble way, which may not always be traditional higher ed. And that is what I saw the value of the work I had done 20 years ago, but what I see with these organizations right now. I'd say the last thing too is that there's a restlessness, and we're seeing this. We're seeing lower matriculation rates, particularly for young men going into college,
Right.
right?
Yes.
That doesn't mean I hate college, but that's an assumption. We haven't talked to them. That doesn't mean I hate work. No, that means what is an alternative that is going to allow me to continue to grow and learn.
Yeah.
And so we literally have a high school principal that has approached the Center for Youth and the Future of Work to reimagine what would a 13th year look like if we could recreate that in a way that is a high dose of work and school, but not in a school setting,
Right.
that reimagines and reengages young people.
Yeah.
Because we know it will become a chronic employment issue if we are not dealing within the 18 to 24-year-old and getting them into the mainstream economy.
Right.
And so that's what we're excited about. And we hope to incubate that. We have an incredible, like I said, entrepreneurial, as we say, principal who is like, let's whiteboard it, let's create it, let's incubate it, let's make it happen. And I'm ready because it's time. And the truth is, it has to be done cross-sectorally. There are the employers, there's the intermediary, there's the school, but this is a principal who's saying, I am not just happy that they graduate. If I really care deeply, and that's a hard statement, and I should know plenty care, but if I am looking at this as lifelong learning, what is happening to my young men who are not matriculating?
Right.
Where are they going? How are they navigating? Who are they trusting for their choices for job and future ed decisions?
Right.
So creating a clear opportunity for them in that year is important.
And actually, at that workforce conference where we met,
Yes.
one of the speakers spoke about how young men are actually that age range that you spoke of are the least likely to join the workforce right now. So it's tying in hand with what you're talking about, education. So this 13th
And
year.
engagement. And we don't have to call it 13th year. It could be an incredible transition year. I mean, like you already know my academic background, and you could tell I've done well in traditional academic settings, but literally between high school and college, I joined the City Volunteer Corps. And it was through the equivalent of an AmeriCorps model. This was the 80s, the height of the AIDS epidemic. It's kind of hard to imagine right now. I worked on an AIDS ward or served on an AIDS ward, and I received a stipend, and then also received scholarship money that I could apply to go to the City University of New York of what I did. And so that year for me, the growth that I had was unbelievable. I will tell you, that really became my love letter to New York, because I was able to see things in New York that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I understood the AIDS epidemic in ways, or pandemic in ways that other people would not. I'm grateful I did that at 18. And I think we need to have more of those opportunities, whether it's done through national service, whether it's created through employment fellowship years. There has to be a way that is an opportunity for young people. Because think about what we spoke about earlier. In high school, if it's all about just the academics, where are we giving them a place to flex, to experience, to be social in a non-school way, where they get to build agency and work behavior skills? We have to do it.
Yeah, and building the agency part is so critically important, and that sounds like you got a lot of that with your experience.
Oh yeah, there's no question. I received a lot of that with my experience, and that had a lot to do with, we recently had a mayoral election, and I'm not trying to be political here, but I'm talking about engagement in particular. We saw a record level that we hadn't seen young people vote for in a local election like that in 60 years. Think about that.
Wow.
Right? So we have a narrative of young people being disengaged. And not actually, that voter engagement blew me away. None of us anticipated that. It was a contentious election. We know that. But what I think was fascinating about it is it said something about how many young first-time voters there were.
Yeah.
And that says to me, young people have voice, They want to say something. They want to be engaged.
Yeah.
When you have a candidate that had 100,000 volunteers, that's a level that we haven't seen, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? That means that I actually think it's like people want to be part of a solution and a level of engagement in this city. So what are the opportunities or vehicles for them to do that in?
Right.
And I do believe that's one of them. And for me, being in the City Volunteer Corps, the sense of agency was important because as a young Latina in the 80s, the crack epidemic was happening. There were a lot of things happening.
Yeah.
People were not speaking well of the city.
Yeah.
People were talking about bonfire, the vanity, right? You could name all the, right? Like what was all of this? It was, and yet I got to see one of the most compassionate New York that anyone could see. I got to see how the health leaders in this city made a difference in how we understood AIDS nationally and internationally.
Yeah.
And I felt gifted. I was part of that, especially when I saw so many disproportionately Latinos and African Americans die of AIDS.
Yeah.
And many died with low T cell counts that would have been considered AIDS if the definitional change had included them. And so I wouldn't have known that unless I was there. So I was able to understand the science of it, but the piece around advocacy and responsibility for colleagues and peers, that has been a common thread of value for me ever since.
Yeah. So based off of your experience with that, what would you say to young people right now who maybe want to be engaged with their community, maybe not even just in New York City, but throughout New York State?
Yeah. So I'd say throughout New York State is we need more service opportunities that are stipended, that offer, because again, usually that might be one of the first intergenerational opportunities that they have, which I think is important. Cross-racial opportunities as well too, cross-class opportunities. Again, what are the silos, right? Where do we, so there needs to be more service. There needs to be more structured employment opportunities for high school students in ways we've not seen before. Like I said, why can't we just open up all of June? Just open, everybody gets it. Their office is a classroom. Could you imagine, even if it's just a week, how that could radically change how young people understand their role in this world? The other thing that I would say is that it would be great if we could understand for young people that they may need time to explore, reimagine, and rethink of where they want to go without assuming that K through 12 did that all.
Yes.
That's a heavy burden.
Yes.
On higher ed, when we have in such a rapidly changing space. We are in a place where we have schools that are trying to figure out an AI policy when they've been using AI since grade school, right? Like I'm just saying, like, I'm like, really? We're still on that? I said, that's not the issue. It's around how are they using it? If a teacher is not understanding someone's using AI right now, then they're missing it. I understand that with my doctoral students, right?
Yeah.
So we have to understand where we're behind young people, but where we also have a responsibility to show leadership, to have more pathway opportunities.
Yeah. So given your background and all the experience you have, especially on a global scale in terms of workforce development, what do you see in terms of reflecting on the national scale in the economy here?
Well, thank you for that. So first of all, we often talk about the economy and workforce and national numbers, but the truth is, the true telling is that we have to understand there are regional economies. What are the regional economies and what are the local employment statistics? Because when we disaggregate the data, we actually see where there's huge impacts, right? We get to see where are we seeing young men engaged or not engaged? Where are we seeing women or not seeing women? Why does Baton Rouge look different than the other parts of Louisiana? So it's important we understand how regionally defined the economy is. And we need to talk about it in that way too. Aggregated numbers almost hide the disproportionality that happens in places where we might see twice that number of unemployment when we look at it locally. So I think that's important for us to understand. Why I'm so excited to be on this podcast because you really look at New York State, and it is its own economy. There's a lower state economy and there's the upper state economy. What does that mean? As you know, right? What is energy and wind and alternative to fossil fuel? What do all those things mean for the larger state in ways? But right now, New York City has been viewed as a financial sector, but post-COVID, we've seen some of those jobs not linked to residency. So where do young people think about work? Well, they could think about work a lot remotely.
Yeah.
Right, in ways they hadn't. And yet, how many classes have they had in high school that are remote? So where's their kind of training and exposure and to navigating employment and work skills remotely on their job? Really? Why can't we figure out something even earlier?
Right.
So we have an internship experience even here at the fund where we have it hybrid. Because we think that's important too. What are the skills, communication skills, and management skills that young people have to respond to so that they are prepared when they go into an environment and say, I did not just have an internship, I had a remote internship. What does that mean? How do you clock in? How do you work online? All those things. So we're proud of that.
Yeah, it's not just pulling up the PowerPoint, making sure to share your screen correctly. It's also the social aspect of doing things remotely. It's different than it is in person.
Yeah.
And so it is a really important skill to learn, especially for our youth, because realistically, that is a direction that we're going to continue to go. There will be hybrid positions for the rest of forever at this point.
Yeah. It's not going away.
No.
And I would say, as an educator, that's super important for educators as well, too.
Yeah.
They were not expected to. I mean, it's pretty amazing what we were able to get done during COVID time, but the truth was that they were not prepared or trained to work in a remote environment. And in fact, when we, out of the Center for Youth and Future Work, we do these kinds of trainings as we talked about overseas. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating is people continue to say the management training and support for working remote and working with an intergenerational workforce are their two top priorities. So that says something. If that's what the employers are feeling, right? Think about how that new employee is experiencing that.
Yeah. And so talking about these regional economies, how does that translate to a remote setting?
Okay, so even before so one thing that is, I would say, uniform across young people is that due to some impacts of AI, we still don't know the end if AI is destroying more jobs or creating. I could give you a thinker on one that's saying it's the best thing since sliced bread. I could give you a critic that says it's the worst thing since Hades, right? So I could give you either one. What we know is that the current disruption right now, as a result of employment, is hitting entry-level jobs in ways we hadn't thought about before. And so that market is much more opaque for people who are graduating.
Right.
So what does entry-level mean? If people are integrating AI right now, that will usually mean for some of those entry-level roles. So I think that's harder for young people who are working, and we see that, who are looking for work. We see that, particularly for undergrads who want to do internships here and graduate students who want to do internships here. When we're talking about rural communities in particular, what we've seen in the last 20 years is a level of centralization where we've seen small schools shutting down, people having to travel more for education and maybe for work. You've seen this. This is something that has pros and cons to it. In rural communities, so often they understand now that they have to leave their communities for work.
Yes, that's very common.
Yeah, and that's really, so think about an opaque market, and then you have to leave regionally too.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a real challenge, and particularly for people in rural communities, if they were not engaged in a hybrid learning environment or understood a larger global economy, they're not even part of thinking about hybrid jobs to stay where they are, right? It's so interesting that it's not that hybrid work allows people to stay in rural communities. What it allowed folks to do was leave more expensive communities to go to a less expensive housing market while keeping their job. Think about that, not the reverse. Right? And so that, I think, is fascinating. So there are different solutions for rural communities. which doesn't surprise me. We're seeing people who are saying, how do we create, and we see this in upstate New York, chip building hubs, right?
Right.
Right. What does that mean for that part in upstate New York for talent that we can pull in from all these different counties, right, that we hadn't thought about before? Also, rural communities, we underestimate the level of distrust that has been created by being abandoned.
Yes.
By employers, right?
Yes.
And they were just announced a few weeks ago, a place where thousands of people are going to be unemployed. A third of a community is going to be unemployed.
That's
the impact that has in a rural community, then on the economy that was there to service these employees.
Yeah.
So it reverberates there.
Yeah.
So this is huge, right? A one company town is not healthy. We need diverse economies, even in rural diverse markets, even in rural economies. It's a real challenge. And I always say that the trust factor, what we have to do to build trust in rural economies goes a long way too.
Dr. Nieves, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask, did you have another book that you're planning to release soon?
We do. Oh, my goodness. So we have a third book that's going to be coming out probably in another year. And it's really looking at this idea of cross-sectoral solutions in education. And remember I talked about those doctoral students in leadership and innovation?
Yeah.
We looked at students all over the world, and we looked at their different problems of practice and how they built cross-sectoral solutions to manage their biggest challenges. And so that's what that book is. It's a collaborative of looking at least 6 different places around the world.
Oh, wow. That's going to be a great book.
Oh, I'm excited.
Yes, for sure. So definitely check that out when it's out.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely check these out, too, if you can. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with before we close up here?
Yeah, I'd like to leave with that young people, particularly about their employment statistics, are done differently in almost every state. There isn't a uniform way of thinking about youth engagement in the employment sector.
Oh.
And as a result of that, their voice, their organization is not often thought of. And yet there's a light switch that goes on where we consider them adult workers at 25, and yet we're not coordinated before that. And so I want youth voice to be central to that, and to think about youth employment and engagement strategies as not always being based in an education alone lens, but the both and lens of both work and education.
Dr. Nieves, is there anything else that you want to kind of leave us with before we wrap up here today?
Sure. One of the things I'm really excited to leave with is that I've talked about how we work with executives overseas. Well, we have a Young Global Leaders program where we're actually working with high school students that have been from the South Bronx or in the South Bronx, and we take them overseas and immerse them in what we call this high academic and applied learning in ways that they may not traditionally experience. And so what we know is that, A, they're more global than we assume, they're intellectually curious, and they want to have more employment and applied and travel experiences. And so that reinforces that. So this idea, and that I love it that it's public school students from the South Bronx, right? Because when we talk about the value of study abroad and apprenticeships and internships, we often don't talk about it in relationship to high school students, particularly public high school students.
Yeah.
So we are excited that we have launched that Global Youth Leaders program, and we're excited to expand it.
Honestly, that's a really cool program, and I think that a program like that would really do well for rural students as well.
Absolutely.
You know, because I know where I grew up, there were kids that never left my hometown because they didn't have access, right? For whatever reason, they didn't have a car, their family didn't have a car, they didn't have the money to be able to even go an hour away from where they grew up.
You know, Shay, we talk about one New York City, but that's the story of some people and young people in their boroughs as well.
Right?
Right? Like, yes. I mean, we grew up saying going to the city, which is Manhattan, right? Like you live in your borough, but you go to, and people can stay in their boroughs. But I think exactly that. How do we make sure that we think broader about these opportunities and where we bring young people who are from rural communities. Because what we know is that residential and occupational segregation has also had racial disparity and impacts.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be amazing to take our South Bronx youth along with Central New York youth to this incredible experience in the UK? I think
wonderful.
That would be great.
It would be
okay, maybe
so
that's what we have to do next. Let's talk about
we should
that.
figure that out.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, well, thank you so much for leaving us with that. I think that is a beautiful program, and I'm looking forward to seeing it grow as well. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us and for listening in. Today, we had a wonderful guest, and I'm so grateful to have had her and to been able to sit in their beautiful Manhattan office. It's lovely here. Please make sure you look into the Fund for the City of New York, because it's an amazing institution that's been here for quite a while now. So check it out, find them online, check out their programs, get some kids involved in it if you know any that would be interested. It's a wonderful opportunity, and we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast episode. Thanks so much.